One lost white sneaker was left alone on the shoulder of a desolate Fort Worth road. A few feet away, an open high school notebook danced in the hot Texas breeze. Normal, innocuous objects. Something about them wasn't right, though. They should have been in a backpack, on a teenager's foot, not littering the ground. These were the initial hints at a mystery that would plague detectives for almost a quarter century. This wasn't trash. This was the final remains of a 17-year-old woman who just disappeared one spring afternoon in 2001. She'd kissed her mom goodbye that morning before departing for school. Just another day or so it seemed. By dinner, her seat was vacant, and that vacancy became decades of nagging questions. If you enjoy tales of cold cases getting their long-awaited justice, do not forget to subscribe and click that notification bell, because today we are examining a case that illustrates one mighty truth. Justice may take years, maybe decades, but it never does stop coming. A town where cowboy hats crossed with city skylines. Almost 500,000 residents, but still the type of place where you greeted your neighbors on the way by and knew the mailman personally. Teenagers rode up to the mall on Friday nights. People still left their doors open by day. Violent crime? That was something that occurred elsewhere. The local high school had just won a football championship. The economy was booming, and digital cameras were the latest thing. Texting was new enough that most everyone still preferred a brief phone call. In the midst of this easy, mundane American life, Ashley Thornton vanished. It was the 17th of May, 2001. Ashley was 17 years old and had been walking home from a friend's house as she'd done at least 100 times before along the same route. She was fewer than 5 blocks from her 2-story family home when she disappeared. By the time the sun set, her parents were phoning every friend, every neighbor, everyone who may have spotted her. By midnight, there were police officers ringing doorbells and scouring the streets with flashlights. The following morning, all they were left with were 2 eerie clues: a white sneaker and a spiral-bound math textbook. No blood, no witnesses, no body. Only 2 ordinary objects that suddenly weighed with significance. Crime scene photographers huddled in the dawn sun, snapping pictures that would trouble them for years. Shadows cast long across the pavement, mute testimony to a teenager who'd simply vanished. May 17th, 2001, Thursday started like any other day at the Thorntons. Ashley's alarm clock went off at 6:15 a.m. She spent 20 minutes in the bathroom, just enough time for her mom to rib her about it, before heading downstairs to get dressed. She wore blue jeans, a white Dallas Cowboys t-shirt, and her favorite white sneakers. She picked up a piece of toast and slung her backpack over one shoulder. "See you at dinner," she yelled as she walked out the door. Those were the last words her mother would ever hear. Ashley was a junior at James Martin High School, a good student with a B average and a flair for the dramatic. She was involved in the photography club and had a reputation for having an easy smile. Security cameras captured her entering school at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Friends later verified she'd had all of her morning classes, eaten with her regular lunch crew at 12:30, and left campus at 3:20 that day. That's where things begin to get important. Rather than taking the bus home like she normally did, Ashley said she'd be going by another friend's house, just to pick up a CD, completely within the realm of a music-driven teenager of the early 2000s. Phone records show she called that friend, Jason Reeves, at 3:32 p.m. from a payphone near the school. The call lasted less than a minute. Jason later told investigators she'd said, "I'm on my way. Be there in about 20. His house was about a mile from the school, a short walk through the quiet Ridge Hills neighborhood. Ridge Hills was a neat, middle-class Fort Worth enclave. Tree-lined streets, neat lawns, houses built in the 60s and 70s. But for Ashley, it wasn't just another neighborhood. It was home base. She'd spent her childhood here, riding her bike down these same sidewalks, door to door selling Girl Scout cookies, babysitting for families who watched her grow up. Everybody recognized her face. Everybody adored her. It was the sort of neighborhood where households still left their garage doors open and children played in the street until the streetlights were on. And that's precisely why her vanishing was so chilling. Ashley never reached Jason's house. When she failed to appear for dinner at 6:30 p.m., her parents did what any anxious parents would do. They began calling her friends. They initially hoped that she'd simply lost time, but by 8:15, after contacting everyone they could think of, hope had given way to terror. At 9:22 p.m., her parents called the Fort Worth Police Department and formally reported Ashley missing. Due to her unblemished record, no runaway history, good grades, and a tight family, the police considered the case seriously from the very beginning. No waiting 24 hours. At 10 p.m., patrol cars were already cruising the neighborhood, knocking on doors and canvassing along Ashley's way home. The following morning, Friday, May 18th, at 7:15 a.m., a jogger running down Bayer Avenue stumbled upon something that turned everything around. There, by the side of the road, was one white sneaker. He dialed 911 straight away. When police came and started canvassing the area, they discovered Ashley's mathematics notebook roughly 30 feet away, partially buried in a storm drain. The instant investigators spotted those objects, they realized they weren't merely working on a missing person case. This was something more sinister. Discovering those personal belongings such as that, it was like a whole new ballgame. Detective Sandra Polson would later explain to reporters, individuals don't willingly leave a shoe behind. By Friday lunchtime, Fort Worth PD had established a special task force with Detective Polson, a 10-year veteran, heading up the search. Search dogs were called in. Volunteers swarmed the streets with flyers featuring Ashley's smiling school photo. The community came together as never before. By Friday night, over 200 volunteers had reported to Ridgely Hills Baptist Church, which was used as the search effort command center. Local companies contributed food, water, and printing capacity. The high school canceled all weekend activities and the students formed their own search groups. The whole city was on hold. Police, meanwhile, toiled day and night during those first 48 hours. They pulled surveillance tapes from all the stores along Ashley's path. They interviewed residents, joggers, deliverymen, anybody who may have been within a block of Bayer Avenue that afternoon. Officers checked storm drains, vacant houses, wooded lots, any place she may have been grabbed. Her bedroom was fingerprinted. Her computer was scanned for recent use. Investigators subpoenaed her phone records and cross-referenced local sex offender databases for anybody living in the area. By Saturday night, 2 nights after she went missing, detectives had reduced it all to one spooky conclusion. Ashley went missing in a 17-minute time frame. She was last spotted by a mailman on Bayer Avenue at 3:40 p.m., heading toward Jason's house. At 3:57 p.m., Jason started calling her house, asking why she hadn't shown up. 17 minutes, less time than it takes to see a sitcom. In broad daylight on a mellow suburban street, a 17-year-old woman had been kidnapped, and no one noticed a thing. As the sun set on a Saturday, May 19th, Ridgely Hills no longer seemed the friendly, welcoming neighborhood it had always been. Police cars moved through the streets. Searchlights scanned through backyards and cul-de-sacs. Parents kept their children indoors, and Ashley's parents stood in front of the local news cameras, voices breaking with sorrow. Someone saw something, her dad begged. Please, if you know anything whatsoever, call the police. We just want our daughter home. The neighborhood watched, waited, and prayed for a break that would not come for nearly 24 years. Fort Worth PD had expanded the search to nearly half the city by the end of the first week. Their focus quickly shifted to Lake Benbrook, a massive 3,700-acre reservoir just a 7-mile drive southwest of where Ashley was last seen. A fisherman said he spotted a young woman in her description, standing on the lake shore on the night of May 17th. Dive teams combed the lake's murky bottom for 3 agonizing days. Sonar-equipped police boats probed the lake floor, and helicopters mounted with thermal imaging instruments flew over the wooded shores. But when it was all done, they found nothing. We treated that lake like a crime scene, recalled Detective Polson years later, but there wasn't a single trace of her. Detective Polson and her team searched every inch of that lake. Every beach, every cove, every boat ramp, she said afterwards. We even drained some of the spillway. We were meticulous. But at the end of the day, there was nothing linking Ashley to that location other than one unconfirmed sighting. And so the search continued. Abandoned and remote areas across Tarrant County became the focus for investigators. The types of areas where someone might stash something, or someone. A deserted cotton mill on the fringe of town, a closed shopping mall that was to be demolished, a partially constructed subdivision where work had ceased when money ran out. For 2 weeks of interminable sorrow, groups of officers and cadaver dogs systematically combed 27 abandoned buildings, room by room, crawl space by crawl space. But the more they dug, the more it became apparent. Someone had taken extreme measures to wipe clean any hint of what had become of Ashley Thornton. By June 2001, police had questioned over 200 individuals. Some provided what had seemed like promising information. Initially, Barbara Winters, a 68-year-old retiree who resided directly on Bayer Avenue, informed police that she'd seen a dark pickup truck parked close to where Ashley's shoe had been discovered. It was there for about half an hour, she said, and then it was gone. I only saw it because it was in front of my view of the Robinsons' azaleas across the street. A mundane point, but in a Texas neighborhood full of pickups, it wasn't quite sufficient. Then Michael Daniels, a landscaper who was working just a few houses from where the notebook had appeared. He reported to detectives he'd witnessed a young woman having an argument with someone in a vehicle at 3:45 p.m. She was agitated but not frightened, he described in his report. I just assumed it was teens having a fight. Shown the photo of Ashley, Daniels paused, but then couldn't definitively say it was her. Perhaps the most compelling clue came from Tammy Wilson, a clerk at a convenience store on Western Boulevard. Tammy was convinced Ashley had walked into her store around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, nearly an hour after the presumed time of her abduction. I'll never forget her face, Tammy told police. She looked tired, like she'd been crying. But when investigators reviewed the store's surveillance footage, the image was too grainy to confirm anything, and worse, it didn't match the established timeline. This became a painful pattern, hopeful leads that crumbled under scrutiny. And then the bogus tips, and they came in droves. A truck driver said he'd picked Ashley up and taken her to Oklahoma. A Dallas psychic said her body would be found along railroad tracks with something blue around it. A Houston inmate said his cellmate had boasted of killing her. Every tip had to be investigated. Everyone consumed time, effort, and scarce resources. And every dead end nibbled away at whatever hope was left. If you're still tuned in and keeping up with this tragic story, go ahead and give that like button. It actually helps more people see cases like Ashley's. Because let me tell you, this one has turns you won't anticipate. Ashley's parents, Robert and Diana Thornton, meanwhile, were stuck in some state of emotional limbo, half grief, half hope, and all despair. They mortgaged their house to offer a $50,000 reward. They went on local and national television, making appeals for leads, and when police resources turned away from older cases, they took matters into their own hands. We were detective adjacent, Robert wrote later in his memoir. Diana maintained a handwritten journal, every call, every reported sighting, every shred of information. We'd investigate ourselves if police couldn't, she said. We traveled to Oklahoma on a lead. We flew to Florida when someone believed they spotted her on a beach. We went to California when a girl with Ashley's name applied at a restaurant. None of them were her. The Thorntons had spent more than $100,000 of their own money on their own investigation by 6 months. Diana went on an indefinite leave of absence from her work as a dental hygienist. Robert, an electrical engineer, worked double shifts to finance their search. The pressure was tremendous. Their marriage struggled under the long-term pressure and mourning. Their son, Mark, 14 years old, began misbehaving in school, his grades plummeting as every scrap of attention remained riveted on his lost sister. Newspaper coverage, which had been daily and frenzied at first, slowed. Local television stations continued to broadcast occasional reports, but national media, the ones that had previously shown Ashley's smiling face on America's Missing segments, lost interest. The light faded, the tips dried up, and for the Thorntons, life fell into a bittersweet cadence of waiting, wondering, and refusing to lose hope. When America's Most Wanted featured Ashley Thornton's case in July 2001, it was an instant reaction. For a fleeting moment, hope seemed to have come back. The phone lines burned and tips flooded in from all over the country. Once again, all of the leads went nowhere. By autumn, Ashley's name had softly receded from front pages to small paragraphs deep within the hometown newspaper. Television coverage that had greeted nightly newscasts with a kickoff style became occasional, fleeting insertions. The search parties, hundreds strong once, began to dwindle to a few devoted family friends who would not abandon the effort. And then there was September 11th. In the aftermath of that unthinkable national tragedy, the disappearance of one Texas teenage girl fell out of the public mind. Her tale, once a matter of pressing and heartbreaking urgency, became an afterthought in a country consumed by grief of its own. The investigation technically stayed open, but by early 2002, it had all but gone cold. Detective Sandra Polson was reassigned to new cases. The task force disbanded. The once busy tip line, manned 24 hours a day, was reduced to a single voicemail box checked twice a week. In the Fort Worth Police Department's records room, Ashley's case filled 3 large boxes, a silent archive of unanswered questions, witness statements and search reports. Lab tests on her sneaker and notebook, both yielding nothing helpful. Security camera footage too poor to recognize anyone. Polygraph tests on a number of persons of interest, all eventually cleared. Shots of Lake Benbrook, the abandoned cotton mill, and Ashley's unrummaged bedroom, suspended in time. Bits of a puzzle that refused to coalesce. When the first anniversary of Ashley's vanishing arrived in May of 2002, the remnants of that initial frantic search effort had worn away. The Ridgely Hills Baptist Church Command Center had stood for years. The flyers were faded, peeling, and gone. Even the enormous billboard off University Drive and Interstate 30, with its one-time blow-up of Ashley's beaming face, was now occupied by a billboard promoting a new housing project. For the vast majority of Fort Worth, life had gone on. But somewhere in the world, someone still kept a ghastly secret, something that would remain hidden for 24 years. For the Thorntons, time bifurcated, before Ashley vanished and then after. What had started as raw panic and desperate hope gradually calcified into a heavy, indelible grief. A new way of living none of them had wanted but couldn't shake. Diana Thornton stopped sleeping in her own bed. For that first year, she sat watch on the couch in the living room, waking with a start at the noise of passing vehicles or a late-night call. When she slept, nightmares materialized, Ashley's voice calling out from a place she could not find. "I became a professional mourner," Diana said in a 2005 interview. "I was no longer a dental hygienist. I was no longer really a wife or mother. I was just the woman whose daughter disappeared." Robert Thornton dealt with it differently. He channeled his sorrow into doing something. He established a special tip line at home. He even constructed one of the first missing person websites for Ashley in the early days of the internet, when you still logged onto it. He traveled hundreds of miles a month following any potential lead, however thin. All that relentless searching cost him his job. His boss could no longer ignore his habitual absenteeism. "I'd rather be broke than wonder if I missed the one call that could bring her home," he explained to a local reporter after selling the family car to pay for another search. But the most quietly destroyed was Mark Thornton, Ashley's little brother. He was only 14 when his sister went missing, and although his parents were still present in body, emotionally, they were absent. Obsessed with loss, they did not notice that they were losing their son as well. By his junior year, Mark just couldn't handle the gazes and whispered sympathy anymore. He quit James Martin High School, the same school his sister had gone to. He got his GED and joined the military at 18, looking in his own mind for space from the vacant bedroom his parents left undisturbed down the hall. "Mom and Dad didn't know they were losing me as well," he told a rare interview on the 10th anniversary of Ashley's disappearance. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every picture had this Ashley-sized gap in it. Eventually, I felt that I wasn't enough to fill it." By 2006, the pressure was too great. Robert's ferocious energy conflicted with Diana's stoic despair. The two drew increasingly apart, not by rage, but by different languages of sorrow. They never divorced. Neither of them could stoop to making it official, but no longer lived together. And then there was the community. Fort Worth revealed both the best and worst of humanity. Initially, neighbors had rallied around the Thorntons, left meals, assisted with searches, lit candles. But with months turning into years, distance replaced compassion, and gossip started to take the place of prayers. Ashley's classmates organized candlelight vigils. Local businesses donated money for searches. The whole community was behind the Thorntons for a time. But when months became years, sympathy that had run in such abundance began to dwindle. People, as Diana would later tell it, get uncomfortable with grief that doesn't end. It makes them remember how precarious life truly is. At the 5-year point, the Thorntons were a silent symbol of tragedy in a community that liked to think of itself as safe. Invites to block parties were in short supply. Friends stepped off the curb to steer clear of poignant small talk. And then there were the whispers, those nasty little fabrications that increase in volume the longer a mystery unravels. Ashley hadn't been kidnapped, some asserted. She'd bolted. Others maintained she'd been in her teens and pregnant, or on drugs, or that she'd eloped with a mature man. Each speculation more sorrowful than the previous one, each one deflecting responsibility from a potential predator onto Ashley herself. It's simpler for folks to think that a young teenage girl made poor decisions than it is to accept that monster's among us. Robert said in an op-ed for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, marking the 7th anniversary of his daughter's disappearance. Ashley made no choice. Someone chose her. Nevertheless, the Thorntons would not allow her memory to escape. Each 17th of May, the day she disappeared, they organized the Remember Ashley Walk, walking along the same path she walked that afternoon. They even established a small scholarship at James Martin High School for students who were passionate about photography, just like Ashley. Every year on her birthday, November 3rd, they set off lanterns into the darkness. 17 the first year, 18 the next year, and one more each year she was missing. Every light that floated represented something Ashley never had a chance to do. High school graduation, her first vote. College, her first apartment. While media coverage faded with the passage of time, those traditions ensured her memory lived on and provided her family with something to cling to. A tenuous feeling of meaning when closure remained so elusive. Now, what's the time where you're watching from? You'd be amazed at how many cold case breaks occur in the wee hours, when a detective can't sleep, or when an old case catches someone's attention. Detective Polson, for example, never quite dropped Ashley's case. She kept the file stashed in her home office years after being reassigned. And retired cop Martinez? He spent years searching out witnesses on his own time, years after he'd handed in his badge. For families such as the Thorntons, time is the enemy and the friend. Each passing year fades hope, but it also ensures new technology, new tools, and new means of uncovering the truth. By 2015, 14 years after Ashley had vanished, the family had established a tentative rhythm of living with grief. Diana went back to working part-time. Robert began a support group for families of the missing, and Mark, Ashley's younger brother, had finished his military time and was living in Colorado, naming his baby daughter Ashley, after the aunt she would never know. They hadn't ever accepted her loss, not ever, but they'd learned to get used to it, the way you learn to live next to an old wound. You never cease to hurt, just cease to expect you'll ever get better. Then, in 2016, arrived the next installment. Ashley's case was formally sent to the Fort Worth Police Department Cold Case Unit. It wasn't a surprise. 15 years had lapsed with no arrest, no body, no concrete lead. The physical evidence, a shoe, a notebook, some smudged fingerprints, had been run through again and again, never uncovering anything new. "We never close a missing persons case," declared Captain James Morgan at the media briefing, announcing the action. "But we have to be realistic about allocating resources." He promised the public that cold case detectives would look over the file periodically and check on any credible new leads. But in fact, as many within the department knew, periodically usually equaled years, and credible new leads rarely materialized. The Fort Worth Cold Case Unit was already drowning in files, decades of unsolved murders and disappearances. Ashley's case box was added to the others in a climate-controlled evidence warehouse, shelved on a high shelf in aisle 12, between a 1998 convenience store shooting and a 2003 hit and run. In that box, 2,847 pages of interviews, lab reports and search logs, 327 photos, 16 hours of taped witness statements, and not one single conclusive lead. Pause. But as we'll see, the story wasn't over yet. Sometimes all it takes is one forgotten clue, or one person who just can't let go. For years, Ashley Thornton's case sat untouched, gathering dust in the cold case warehouse while the world outside kept spinning. Fort Worth expanded, new subdivisions materialized, and the high school Ashley once passed through was renovated. The lockers where she had stored her books were replaced, and along with them, another concrete part of her narrative went quietly missing. Detective Laura Polson, the initial lead on the case, retired in 2018 after 3 decades on the police force. Her replacement, Detective Marcus Wilson, found himself with a burdensome caseload, 43 unsolved files, one of them Ashley's. I went over her case my first month, Wilson testified later. I was impressed by how well the initial investigation had been done, but also at how limited their tools were at the time. And he was correct. The early 2000s were basically the investigative Stone Age in comparison to today. DNA analysis was sluggish, expensive, and only applied if a clean biological material was discovered. Something Ashley's case did not have. Cell phone signals could only be traced by triangulating pings from towers, not actual GPS. Social media was not even on the radar. And whatever security cameras did exist recorded video so low resolution, you could confuse a suspect with a silhouette. But by 2020, everything had changed. Investigators had DNA databases that could trace killers through distant cousins. Artificial intelligence could clean up blurry footage. Digital forensics could resurrect data from long-dead devices. So the question wasn't if technology could solve old cases. It was whether it could solve this one. And hey, if you're the kind of person who believes every case deserves another look, go ahead and share this story. It helps spread awareness and reminds people why persistence matters. In July 2020, the Fort Worth Police Department got a federal grant to re-examine 20 cold cases using advanced DNA analysis. Ashley's case didn't make the list. There just wasn't enough physical evidence. But then arrived 2020's big disruptor, the COVID-19 pandemic. With the city locked down, fieldwork came to a standstill. No in-your-face interviews, no warrants served in person. All of a sudden, Detective Wilson had something most detectives never had: time. So I began pulling old cases, he explained later. I concentrated on cases that were on the docket on big anniversaries. Ashley's was going to reach its 20th anniversary. At least I figured we could send her family an update and demonstrate we hadn't forgotten about her. The courtesy review was soon turned into a full-scale deep dive. Wilson poured through 2 decades worth of reports, statements, and lab notes. He cross-referenced witness accounts from Ashley's disappearance with other cases from the early 2000s. And slowly, a strange pattern began to take shape. Not something obvious, not something you'd notice in real time. It was a pattern only 20 years of hindsight could reveal, and it would point to a suspect no one had ever considered. By the spring of 2021, Wilson was being pulled in more deeply than ever. He wasn't supposed to be spying on Ashley Thornton's case. That wasn't in the department's official priorities. But with pandemic slow time and the approaching 20th anniversary, he couldn't bring himself to believe that something was hiding in those 3 dusty old evidence boxes. Sometimes fresh eyes see what tired ones miss, Wilson would later say at a press conference. I had no personal connection to the original case, no emotional bias, just curiosity and 20 years of new tools to work with. He began from scratch. Literally. He first digitized everything. Handwritten reports became searchable text. Blurry pictures were enhanced through digital means, and new visual timelines were built to track Ashley's final known movements. Technology doesn't solve cases, Wilson explained. Detectives do. But technology helps us see things our brains might overlook. And that's exactly what happened. The tiny detail that would eventually blow the case wide open wasn't buried in lab reports or interviews. It was hiding in plain sight, inside a piece of evidence investigators had dismissed 2 decades earlier. Among Ashley's recovered belongings was her notebook, a plain, spiral notebook that everyone had thought was simply a teenager's sketchbook. They were mistaken. Ashley's notebook was not merely a quiet observer to her vanishing, it was a time capsule of forgotten clues. Then in 2001, detectives had thumbed through it in the hopes of catching a glimpse of her mental state or intentions. They noticed nothing out of the ordinary, merely school assignments, doodles, and shopping lists, so it was bagged and put away. What they didn't know is that the true tale wasn't on the pages, but under them. Before we continue, quick break. What is the weather like where you're viewing this? Investigators do not have that luxury. Rain or shine, scorching Texas sun, or frosty dawns, they pursue the truth nevertheless. 2 decades later, Detective Marcus Wilson sent Ashley's notebook to the FBI's Question Documents Unit in Quantico for advanced testing. This time, they used something called electrostatic detection apparatus, SDA technology. It's a method that reveals faint impressions left on blank pages after someone writes on the sheet above. As FBI document examiner Kathy Reynolds described, even if a page is torn out, pressure from the pen creates tiny indentations. SDA technology ionizes the paper surface to reveal those impressions. And what those impressions looked like was breathtaking. Faint but clear, the recovered marks included a partial license plate number, the word followed, and a date, May 14th, 2001. That was 3 days before Ashley disappeared. It meant Ashley had seen someone tailing her. She'd even attempted to capture the plate. This was not random. She'd been singled out. Wilson went straight into the Texas DMV records. Despite having only 4 plate characters, the system gave him more than 200 potential matches in Tarrant County. He began to rule them out one at a time, cross-checking vehicle color, make, and model with witness descriptions from 2001. And then he added more filters: sex offender registry contact hits, past violent crimes, individuals who resided along Ashley's path home. After several days of review, his list had been reduced from 200 to 47, and then yet another contemporary innovation intervened: the science of touch DNA. In 2001, forensic DNA testing required blood, saliva, or some other large biological sample. But by 2021, labs could analyze a few skin cells that were left behind when someone merely touched an object. "We asked for touch DNA on both of Ashley's recovered items," Wilson said afterward. "The shoe was too compromised. She had exposed it to the elements, and it had been touched by too many people. But the notebook, that was different. Kept locked in an evidence bag for 2 decades, the cover of the notebook still retained residual skin cell markings, enough to yield a partial DNA profile. Not full, but sufficient to enter into CODIS, the National DNA Index. No direct hit was returned, but the system pinged on something as valuable: a familial relationship. The profile had genetic similarities with a man named William Mercer, who was convicted of aggravated assault in Houston in 2013. William had no known connection to Fort Worth or Ashley Thornton, but when Wilson ran the family records, one name stood out: Richard Mercer, William's older brother. Richard lived less than a mile from Ashley's walking path in 2001. And here's the kicker: records revealed he'd owned a dark blue pickup truck with a registration plate that included the very same 4 characters Ashley'd written down in her notebook. Wilson would go on to call the moment electric. "When the plate matched, when the location matched, that's when I knew we weren't chasing ghosts anymore. After 20 years of dead ends, we finally had a name." An intense background check showed that Richard Mercer had been a substitute teacher at a number of Fort Worth schools, including Ashley's, when she went missing. He'd never been arrested then. No record, nothing untoward. But after Ashley went missing, he slipped quietly away, first to Amarillo in 2001, then to Oklahoma in 2008. It all ended on April 2nd, 2025. Before dawn, FBI agents and Fort Worth detectives encircled a small ranch-style house in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Unmarked sport utility vehicles cut off both sides of the street. Tactical teams deployed, quiet and deliberate. At 6:17 a.m. on the dot, Richard Mercer walked outside to retrieve his morning newspaper. Robe, coffee mug, the image of normalcy. Rather, he was confronted with a half-dozen drawn guns and the words he'd been able to keep at bay for close to a quarter century. The 58-year-old man did not resist. He simply stood there, unfazed, nearly unemotionally so, as agents cuffed him. Neighbors looked on from windows and porches in shock. They had waved hello to him for years, talked over fences, borrowed tools. Now they watched the same nice guy get escorted to a waiting black SUV. One neighbor spoke with reporters and said that it seemed Mercer was not mad or frightened, just resigned, perhaps even relieved. Nobody on that peaceful street had any idea the man they'd shared years with, the one who mowed his lawn on Sundays and greeted passing children with a smile, was the prime suspect in one of Texas's most eerie cold cases. "He just seemed so normal," said Diane Jenkins, who'd lived across from Mercer for 7 years. "He helped me carry groceries when I broke my ankle. He volunteered at the community garden. How could someone like that be a monster?" The arrest sent shockwaves through Tulsa, but for those who remembered Richard Mercer from Fort Worth, it hit like a lightning bolt, because Mercer had not been just some random guy living around there in 2001. No, he'd been in the middle of it all, so integrated into the community that no one ever once considered looking his direction. Following Ashley's vanishing, Mercer walked with the search groups, shoulder to shoulder with volunteers and loved ones, through fields he knew would probably yield nothing. Candlelight vigil photos revealed him standing respectfully in the back, head down, flickering candle. He even gave $500 to the reward fund of the Thornton family. He distributed flyers. He volunteered at Ridge Hills Baptist Church, the same church that was used as the command center for the search. He brought donuts and coffee to the search teams, recalled Pastor David Williams, whose face was pale when Mercer was arrested. He prayed with Ashley's grandparents. He comforted others, all while maybe knowing exactly what had happened to her. For almost a quarter century, Richard Mercer had created a double life meant to dissolve into thin air. When he departed Fort Worth in late 2001, just as the initial investigation was heating up, he began anew in Amarillo. He toiled as an insurance adjuster, on time, courteous, and completely anonymous. Co-workers remembered him as the kind of fellow who attended the Christmas party but edged out before dessert. Then in 2008, as a true crime television series broadcast an anniversary special featuring Ashley's case, Mercer relocated again, this time to Oklahoma. It was like clockwork. Every relocation was accompanied by renewed public scrutiny. In Tulsa, he was Richard Mercer 3.0, a reserved, middle-aged guy with a rescue hound named Scout whom neighborhood children loved. He attended a local church, participated in charity drives, went on a few dates, but never committed. He didn't vanish from the earth. He dissolved into it. As FBI profiler Dr. Samantha Torres later detailed, predators like Mercer don't hide by pulling back from society. They hide within society. They blend just enough to appear normal, but never enough to encourage genuine scrutiny. It's textbook. That normalcy was his facade, but beneath it, Mercer never ceased tracking the case. When police scoured his online footprint, they uncovered something ominous. Anonymous social media profiles, tracking the Thornton family's posts in true crime forums, speculating about Ashley's vanishing. In a secret drawer, he had stored newspaper headlines about the case. He had even created Google alerts on Ashley Thornton and Fort Worth cold case. He followed the investigation for 24 years, and Detective Wilson explained. He knew when the story broke again, when leads emerged, when things were quiet. He was watching the people who were watching him. When they finally got him into the interrogation room, Mercer began quietly and assertively, claiming innocence. But as detectives began presenting their evidence, the partial DNA match, the ancient cell phone tower records, the just-enhanced 2001 surveillance video, something in him altered. His shoulders sagged. His tone altered. And finally, barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that burst the case wide open. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Those 7 words, "I didn't mean for it to happen," were the crack in the dam. Not a confession, but enough to send everything flooding out. In hours of the announcement, Fort Worth was in shock. Then the disbelief turned to rage. Neighbors, teachers, church members, people who had searched alongside Mercer, felt a visceral sense of betrayal. "I shook his hand," Robert Thornton said to reporters, voice shaking. "I thanked him for assisting us in searching for Ashley. I thanked the man who..." He couldn't continue. At James Martin High School, current and former students recalled Mr. Mercer, the pleasant sub who brought candy and inquired about their day. He'd even asked about Ashley after she disappeared, worried and generous, or so they'd believed. Now that same kindness appeared monstrous in retrospect. "It makes me physically ill," said former principal Dr. Howard Evans. He used his position to access her schedule, her classes, her life. He weaponized trust. It's the worst kind of betrayal imaginable. Social media lit up with disbelief and anger. Residents dug through old memories like evidence. He was everywhere, one wrote. At church, at the memorial, at the fundraisers. He wasn't just hiding in plain sight. He was watching us look for her, listening to us, observing us. What had cut the deepest was that Mercer had inserted himself squarely into the grief of the Thornton family. He'd been in their living room, hugged them, prayed with them, wept beside them, all while reportedly having a clear understanding of what he'd done. For 24 years, Richard Mercer hadn't merely avoided justice, he'd mocked it, faking to assist, faking to care, faking to be the guy who desired Ashley to be found. Richard Mercer was officially accused of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence in relation to the disappearance of Ashley Thornton. No body had ever been discovered, but the prosecutors didn't hesitate. The DNA, the cell records, the enhanced video, the digital trail, they all point to one narrative, District Attorney Eleanor Ramirez said at the press conference. This case shows that time doesn't destroy evidence. It just waits for the appropriate technology to reveal it. There's no statute of limitations on murder, and there never should be on justice. The Thornton family had waited so long that the moment was at once an ending and a start. We prayed for answers for 24 years, Diana Thornton, flanked by her ex-husband Robert for the first time in years, said, "Now that we have them, I realize some answers hurt more than the questions ever did." She took a moment to steady herself. No parent should have to hear those things about their child. Mark Thornton, now 38, 5 years older than his parents were at the time of Ashley's disappearance, flew in from Colorado with his wife and daughter. He confronted the man who was accused of ruining his family at the arraignment. "I stared him in the face," Mark said later. "I wanted him to understand the generations of suffering he created. My daughter will never know her aunt except as a tragedy, a warning. That's his legacy." Even as the trial approached, investigators weren't finished. Forensic experts went back over old evidence with fresh technology, using ground-penetrating radar on properties Mercer once owned or had controlled. With each spadeful of dirt, each soil scan came the hope of at last bringing Ashley home. But as one grief counselor described, closure is a myth in cases like this. "The arrest doesn't bring back Ashley," said Dr. Vanessa Johnson, a traumatic grief psychologist. "It doesn't restore the decades that her family had lost. What it provides is validation, evidence that their suffering had significance, that their persistence counted. Justice isn't always healing, but it allows you to begin breathing again." For detectives around the country, Ashley Thornton's case was more than a breakthrough. It was a template. Detective Marcus Wilson distilled the takeaways into 3 straightforward but poignant truths. First, keep evidence in mind for the future. Something that appears irrelevant today may be the solution tomorrow. Second, never cease to examine cold cases. Because of technology, old evidence may suddenly reveal new tales. And third, keep an eye on behavior. Offenders tend to remain near the very cases they manufactured. Mercer showing up to searches, comforting the family, that's not rare, Wilson explained. We see it more often than you'd think. It's part control, part curiosity, part thrill-seeking. They want to see the aftermath. Now we're looking back at other cold cases with that same lens. Ashley's legacy, though born of tragedy, began to ripple outward in powerful ways. The Thornton family increased the Ashley Thornton Memorial Scholarship at James Martin High School for students who had aspirations of pursuing photography, as she had years ago. The Fort Worth Police Department established an annual Ashley Thornton Cold Case Training Program, educating detectives in the use of new forensic technology and investigative strategies. And Diana Thornton, the mother who could hardly bear to get out of bed only a few years ago, converted her suffering into purpose, becoming a national spokesperson for families of the missing. "If our story can lead even one family to find their child," she said, "then Ashley's light still shines." Every day of Mercer's trial, Robert Thornton sat in the courtroom gallery and put a single-frame picture on the bench next to him. The final school photo ever taken of his daughter. Not an age-progressed drawing, not an artist's estimate, but her. 17 years old, smiling quietly, camera in her hand, full of plans she would never get to make. Her photo was a reminder, unobtrusive but persistent, that there's a person behind every cold case file, not a name on a form or a number in a database. Ashley never had the chance to pen the last chapter of her own book, but those who didn't give up on her ensured the last chapter remained one of justice and not tragedy. Her case is a lesson in persistence and patience. For 24 years, proof sat on a shelf waiting for technology to play catch-up. For 24 years, one family steadfastly resisted despair. For 24 years, justice built its strength, until the day it could finally voice its words. And when it did, it spoke loudly. No case ever goes cold when someone remembers. Throughout America, thousands of families are living their own versions of the Thorntons' extended wait. They celebrate birthdays that are uncelebrated. They put one extra plate at Christmas that remains unfilled. They rise every morning wondering, might today be that day? To them, Ashley's story brings something precious and genuine, evidence that hope is not foolish and tenacity is not misplaced. The journey to justice is not usually a straight one. It curves through years, generations, and scientific revolutions. But as long as evidence is intact and memories live on, that journey is open, awaiting the correct blend of human persistence, evolving science, and perhaps just a dash of grace. Ashley Thornton vanished in 17 minutes on a regular day. It took 24 years to seek her justice, but ultimately, justice found its way home.